Bad things happened to Otto. Some really, really bad things.
Why are you?
But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
What you just watched has President Trump under fire from critics who wonder why he keeps taking the word of dictators and autocrats, including here in Hanoi, when the president said he believes North Korea's Kim Jong-un when Kim claims he didn't know what happened to American college student Otto Warmbier. You remember Warmbier was tortured in North Korean custody, returned 17 months later to his family in a coma, and died a few days after that.
I don't believe he knew about it.
Did he tell you that he did not, did Kim Jong-un tell you?
He felt badly about it. I did speak to him. He felt very badly. He knew the case very well, but he knew it later. In those prisons and those camps, you have a lot of people, and some really bad things happened to Otto. Some really, really bad things.
Why are you?
But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
I'm joined now by the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Bill Richardson. Ambassador Richardson, thank you for coming on. You know North Korea well. You've negotiated with this regime. So let me put this to you. Is it at all possible that Kim would not have known what was happening with Warmbier?
It is totally impossible.
In this video clip, the media attacked Donald Trump for believing that Kim Jong-un didn't know about the inhumane treatment and medical neglect of Otto Warmbier in a North Korean prison. What about the millions of Americans who endure inhumane treatment and medical neglect in state and federal prisons? Do we believe the media and Donald Trump don't know that the same thing is going on in our prison system? After all, hundreds of lawsuits on mistreatment are filed in courts every month. It's time someone brought the mistreatment and murder committed in American jails to the attention of the public. We can no longer allow this to continue. As I pointed out in my videos, the average person commits at least 3 felonies a day without even knowing it. It is sheer hypocrisy to condemn anyone to death for violating some statute, most of which are victimless crimes. Now let's take a look at the pain, suffering and murder committed by the staff in U.S. prisons. 1. A prisoner at FCI Fort Worth named Jack Albertson was allowed to die. Like many others, he had been waiting almost a year for a pacemaker. One night, on January 20, 2012, while in his bunk reading a book, he had a heart attack. The paramedics from MedStar were summoned and they worked on him for more than an hour to resuscitate him. His eyes fluttered briefly, but he died on the floor and was left there all night. A big mouth hack named Ralph, who verbally abused prisoners on a daily basis, placed a sheet over the entryway to Jack's 6-man room and stood guard over his corpse until the following morning. He laughed about it. There's nothing funny about anyone's death, but here's a bit of irony. Jack Albertson died because he needed a pacemaker and didn't get it, but there was a guy who got a pacemaker and didn't need it. He filed a lawsuit after learning the problem was that medical services prescribed too much blood pressure medicine. 2. Louis Castillo, aka Cass, was a friendly little guy who had been losing weight for months to the point of looking like a shriveled prune. He had complained to medical that he couldn't keep the food down. They denied treatment from Thanksgiving 2011 until February 2012, saying "You look good to me, you're just looking for attention." Eventually they took an X-ray and couldn't find his stomach. They sent him out to real doctors and discovered that his diaphragm had ruptured. 3. A prisoner named John Hoagland died in June 2014 after being denied adequate medical treatment. Yet that same month, when a female staffer tripped falling down the steps of the administration building, every nurse and doctor and most of the staff ran to her aid and summoned an ambulance for immediate treatment. Some animals are more equal than others, as George Orwell pointed out. 4. Chuck Hanberry got word on December 2, 2015 that certain lieutenants said the BOP had decided they weren't going to fix his medical problems because too much had already been spent, which they claimed was $1 million. He had previously been in an outside hospital for 9 months due to an infection that resulted from an intestinal puncture during a routine colonoscopy. They installed a colonoscopy bag and transferred him to FCI Fort Worth for recovery and reconnection of the colon to his rectum. The problem was that medical services didn't want to spend the money. They delayed for 2 years, during which time he was repeatedly hospitalized for internal leaks and infections resulting from the colonoscopy tube in his side. Then he developed a painful hernia which they delayed treating for another year. The message is that if you get sick in prison, there's a good chance you'll die from neglect. And if you are healthy when you go to prison, you won't be when you get out. 5. Don Chisler, a wheelchair-bound inmate, was allowed to die in the Lubbock hospice unit. One of the prisoners notified staff that he wasn't breathing, and he was told by a nurse, "So what, he's going to die anyway." 6. John Harrell nearly bled to death from a tooth that broke during extraction and surgery. They gave him some spray and gauze and a liquid diet for one meal. He was still bleeding and couldn't sleep, yet medical did nothing. Finally, on April 7, 2015, an outside doctor prescribed tea bags to stop the bleeding, which it did. Afterwards, they quit selling tea bags at the commissary because inmates were supposedly hiding K2 artificial marijuana in them. Harrell also got no treatment for a kidney stone. After Harrell complained of extreme pain for 10 months, medical services staff assured him he was still, quote, on the list for treatment. Not surprisingly, he never got treatment for the kidney stone and eventually passed it. Later, when an X-ray showed a black spot behind his heart, he never received the rush examination promised by an outside cardiologist. Earlier, Harrell had been imprisoned at FCI Terminal Island in California where he was also mistreated. One of the inexcusable cruelties he witnessed was a wheelchair-bound man without arms or legs, only his hands and feet extended from his stumps. Where was the threat to society that justified sending this helpless man to prison? After all, he couldn't forge checks, fire a gun, or rape anyone. It should be noted that SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, head of the entire Nazi police force and the Gestapo, as well as one of the architects of the Holocaust, recruited his brown shirts from psychopathic street criminals. He chose them because they had no conscience and didn't hesitate to beat and murder citizens. What's the difference between Hitler's psychopaths and the judge and prosecutor who put this quadriplegic in prison? 7. A black inmate died on December 23, 2012. The duty officer tried to get medical services to see him for chest pains, but the nurse refused. Officer Farley personally wheeled him over in a gurney, but he couldn't get anyone to unlock the clinic doors for 10 minutes. The inmate died. 8. Inmate Sanchez died of a heart attack on April 28, 2014 because medical staff refused to treat him for heart pains. He walked back to his unit but died before he made it to his bunk. 9. Lester Perry was a likable used car salesman with numerous untreated medical conditions. Though the fingers of one hand were curled backwards and unusable, medical services never did anything about it. Perhaps due to budgetary considerations, they even waited until the battery on his pacemaker defibrillator was dead for 6 months before replacing it. One day, a doctor tried to prescribe medicine for his Parkinson's disease, even though he didn't have it. Fortunately, he was not among the 6 victims who developed a painful rash and vomited after the medical gurus inserted tetanus medicine under their skin to test for TB. 10. David Dearmond was a military prisoner who served in the Navy's medical radiology unit. He was originally incarcerated at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison and subsequently transferred to a federal prison at Big Springs, Texas. After they nearly killed him, he was transferred to FCI Fort Worth, a Care Level 3 facility for long-term care. I met him in the library on May 7, 2013 and discovered through pages of documentation that his mistreatment was far worse than the alleged mistreatment of the prisoners at Camp Gitmo. He developed a brain tumor that medical services at FCI Big Springs, Texas refused to treat. They argued that he was faking it. His symptoms began in late January 2011, with mild forgetfulness at first, but it quickly progressed to the point where he couldn't remember his inmate registration number, phone codes, or the combination to his lock. He had no memory of events before March 2011 and January 6, 2012, which he calls his blackout period. The events that follow were reconstructed from the testimony of fellow prisoners and his medical records that I read. During his blackout period he was exhibiting odd behavior, talking about the end of the world, and wandering into the wrong units in prison. Being out of bounds landed him in disciplinary segregation. By this time, he was having balance problems. Frequently, he would fall down and sometimes urinate and defecate on himself. During one of his episodes, a correctional officer entered his cell and began kicking him in the ribs while he was unconscious on the floor. His cellie, who repeatedly stole Dearman's commissary, was let out of the hole after the prison staff asked him to lie that Dearman admitted faking his illness. Staff and the prison psychologist claimed he was faking his symptoms in order to get a transfer out of FCI Big Springs. Then, the staff suspected him of doing drugs and subjected him to frequent urine tests. They repeatedly shook down his locker, taking items he was authorized to have and giving them to their prison snitches, which is standard practice in federal prisons. Even worse, according to Dearman, medical reports were faked by Dr. Tubb. Eventually, psychology began to take his symptoms, quote, seriously. They gave him Prozac for his undiagnosed brain tumor. Then, when that didn't work, he was classified as having a psychosis. He was unconscious with respiratory failure before they took his behavior seriously. He was sent to an outside hospital where a battery of tests revealed a brain tumor. It was removed, and he barely survived, but Dearman still must pause to gather his thoughts. 11. Joe Baxter was also a victim of medical neglect. The Bureau of Prison doctor took his blood thinner because he, quote, didn't need it anymore. 2 months later he had a heart attack and landed in the hospital. The outside hospital doctor said he should never have been taken off blood thinner, and they put him back on it. It turned out that the BOP doctors forgot to check their records before taking Joe off blood thinner. If they had checked, they would have seen that he'd previously had several heart attacks, 2 strokes, and open heart surgery. Subsequently, realizing their mistake in taking him off blood thinners, they overprescribed it and his bowels began bleeding. Somehow, he managed to see a BOP doctor at sick call who rushed him to a hospital. While at the hospital his heart stopped due to a blood clot in his legs. They had to put a filter in a vein to stop the clot from moving to his heart. But that's not all. 2 weeks after Joe got out of the hospital, he saw a cancer doctor who diagnosed him with throat cancer. 2 weeks after that, a GI doctor told him he had a cancerous ulcer in his stomach. Another told him he had an aneurysm in his brain. Joe complained to staffer Mendiaz, a nurse practitioner who schedules medical appointments, who informed Joe they weren't going to do anything for him. Luckily, he completed his sentence and went home to die. 12. As for my trivial complaints, I had a serious bout of intestinal bleeding that was inadequately treated for 3 months. Weakened, I fell in the shower, saw spots in front of my eyes and became dizzy. Someone complained to the duty officer, and he called medical, but they were too busy doing pill line to see me. Earlier, I had passed out in the library and awoke with baseball-size patches of sweat all over me. They did an EKG but diagnosed me as dehydrated and suggested I drink more water. Before that I had developed a hernia when my locker shifted while I was moving it. I had to walk across the compound holding it in because the truss they gave me was too big. I endured this condition for 9 months before they got around to ordering the surgery at Baylor Surgical Clinic. Perhaps I shouldn't complain, others suffered for years waiting for their hernia operations. The murder of Larry Bolin. When you deny a helpless prisoner life-saving medication and treatment, it is the same as pulling the plug on a respirator. It's murder by another name. On May 15, 2003, Larry Bolin had died at the Atlanta prison camp. While prison staff share most of the blame, Judge Richard Story in Atlanta, Georgia, and federal prosecutor Michael David Leeton knew they were sentencing Larry to death. They knew it because, at sentencing, he submitted affidavits from 2 physicians that imprisonment would be a death sentence due to his precarious heart condition. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Lita argued that Bolin would get, quote, excellent medical care in prison, knowing full well it was a lie. During Larry Boland's 12 months of unlawful captivity, Larry's life-supporting medications were switched to alternate meds that weren't as effective. Also, his meds were not supplied in a timely manner, and sometimes not at all for a week or more. According to outside physicians, 4 of the medications were critical and had to be taken daily. Furthermore, the BOP refused his pleas to see a cardiologist during those 12 months, and they warned him if he continued to complain about his medical treatment, he would be sent to the Big House, meaning the adjacent maximum security Atlanta penitentiary. This information was relayed to me by a close friend. However, I received additional verification and details in November 2003 from Harold Camp and a Mr. Gay. They were fellow prisoners at the Atlanta Federal Prison Camp, were friends of Larry, and had even provided sworn affidavits to his wife about the denial of medical care. Larry had gone to the clinic one day to report that he was spitting up blood. The medical staff told him there was nothing wrong with him and to go back to his unit or go to the hole. 1 week later, Larry collapsed in the unit with blood dribbling down both sides of his mouth. Before they carted him off on a stretcher, his last words to Harold Camp were, quote, "Those dirty sons of bitches." Larry Boland, who had always opposed government tyranny, predicted that one day the government would kill him. Goodbye, my brave friend. You will never be forgotten, and neither will your murder.